I wasn't actually sure what to expect, I must say. I thought it was going to be one of these quite academic, inward-looking type growth, post-growth, degrowth sorts of festivals, and which were really trying to perhaps reflect on ways to do things differently, and which were hopefully going to be able to be at least more self-reflective in terms of culpabilities and accountabilities. But my expectations were modest, very modest, especially because it was, of course, it was Eurocentric, Euro-centered, and there was very little space on the program even beforehand for that kind of outward-looking discourse setting. And I think my modest expectations were met.
Okay, well, let's come. We'll explore that further. Where is your critique then? Why were you you had low expectations and you were disappointed as well? You weren't quite disappointed, but those expectations were met.
Met my very modest aspirations. Absolutely. Well, lots of reasons, Henry. I think you have to bear in mind that coming from the majority world and going into what seemed to be essentially a European family meeting, to all intents and purposes, and framed accordingly, beyond growth, and and at the bastion, within the bastion of European governance. It was also, for me, it was bound to be something that I found quite alienating in some respects, potentially quite tokenizing for me, and potentially very much.
You were a token there.
I didn't feel like a token, but I thought it could potentially be a tokenizing gesture. And just the one panel that was on exploring degrowth from the global south, and they fly in my colleague who has been based in Bhutan but is of South Asian origin, now based in Canada. So I mean, it's hard not to get away from the tokenizing aesthetic of that, isn't it? Rather than really having much greater engagement with the majority world or the global south. But that I didn't expect more than that. I mean, as I say, it was, the way I framed it at the end was I said, it's a family meeting of people who don't seem to understand that the neighborhood is in crisis, and that neighborhood is in crisis because of them. So I get concerned when I think the post-growth, the degrowth in particular, the degrowth movement, which I'm not really aligned to, but in the course of my work, I do bump into and work with a lot of the degrowth folks and have, some regard for some of their work, is that I think the degrowth seems to have depoliticized and decentered the notion that this economy and this global architecture has a particular origin. There's an origin story to all of this. There's even an origin story to the climate degradation, isn't there? There's an origin story to the reasons why we have the kinds of inequities and the crass chasm in redistributional power that seems to be taking place, and I think that when we think around the way that perhaps global activists, global thinkers, and different players are speaking around reparations and climate reparations around this, we have to remember that this is not just because the climate suddenly, the ozone layer suddenly opened up, that the planet is spontaneously warming up. There's a centuries-old history of extractiveness, of excessive extractiveness and excessive mining from the soil, from the air now, extracting from trees, extracting from plants, and extracting from entire lands. That, of course, is to do with the colonial imperial complex. So that the earth didn't just warm up spontaneously, but there was very little. I think one or two people mentioned that. Jason Hickel was very helpful in framing that and in framing that sort of debate in that explicit way. But I think that for me, that it was just like, well, here we go again in this sort of really disingenuous way of removing culpability and making situations historical orphans,
Okay.
creating situational
Yeah.
orphans rather
Liepollo,
than centering them in a particular.
I wonder, Liepollo, I mean, was there any moments or discussions, or were there any positives that you took away, and you know, and I suppose compared to what, I suppose that you know,
Begs the question. I mean, I think there were a couple of really great panels. I mean, Vandana Shiva can always be relied upon. This is true. Jason can be relied upon. Raj Patel can be relied upon. I can be relied upon. And, you know, quite a few other voices. But I think the fact that the numbers of people and the speakers who presented a heterodox or a more progressive perspective does speak to my concern, which was that it was very much a, you know, a white bread, a very vanilla affair, so to speak, where it seemed as though it was a gathering which, even though it was located in Europe, doesn't understand that this is a global context and that everything that is taking place in Brussels and in those hallowed halls has particular and direct linear impact on the rest of the world, and, you know, particularly on the majority world, on the global south.
Liepollo, can you talk, so what would you have wished to see?
I think I would have wished to see much more, if we're talking about growth and multiple, I would have liked to see a reflect on a meeting that understands multipolarity. So the fact that Europe is not the only center of power, so that even though Europe is a community, it would be useful for them as a community to be able to recognize that they're a community among many others globally. So in community with the African Union, in community with Asia, in community with, you know, the Asia Pacific, in community with Latin American interests, and also in community with the different interest groups which have been talking and resisting different forms of, you know, the different kinds of growth excesses and their impact on our economies, on our livelihoods, on our sustainable development, whatever that may or may not mean, on the debt complex, for example, on the ways in which international relations, international economic relations do play into the complex of a unidirectional power play, and which is led by the US and by Europe. And I think that without that sort of self-awareness, indeed, this was taking place in Europe. So I already said at the outset that my expectations were very modest. So I'm not here trying to recreate and reinvent something that I didn't see. I didn't see anything that I wasn't expecting. So it met my low expectations. And I do think that it's important for me to be able to name that as a person who's fairly neutral. I have no vestedness per se in these debates, other than that, of course, we live in a global world. We are in community with each other. And I think that was kind of this really pious tone that seemed to be set. Hence the booing, indeed. Hence the booing, which was quite appropriate, because there were one or two extremely tone deaf, talking about growth, talking about, well, let's continue trying to grow the economy. It's like, well, that's what we're trying not to do, or we're trying to do this differently. A lot of greenwashing, which was taking place. But I think the other piece that I want to mention is that it's and go back and I guess insist that the idea that we can talk about climate and not talk about coloniality, and expect that the presence of a Vandana Shiva, the presence of a Jason Hickel, the presence of a me, for example, that somehow, in some respects, excavates, cleanses, absolves the meeting, the conference, of its own responsibility to begin to take those sorts of statements and translate them into seeing some blind spots. You know, there's so many blind spots, into seeing those and then beginning to iterate those into forward-looking policy and outward-looking policy. That's just not enough, you know. But this is the thing. It's the kind of the Brussels bubble was at its own, what's at its very best. And I think, you know, this sort of sanctimoniousness is not going to get either Europe or the world in which Europe is in community very far, I think, going forward. And it doesn't do anything to shift the needle on questions of how we're going to begin to talk about reparative justice, reparative economics, restitutional economics, for example. And those are the kinds of conversations which I think are very important. So, I mean, the panel that I was participating on, we were talking about well-being economics, which I think is, you know, myself and my colleague Ritu Verna, we did a 6-country study for about a year. Unfortunately, during COVID, so we couldn't travel. But I mean, it was looking around how different contexts, different countries across 3 different continents, so 3 completely different contexts, are looking at what well-being economics could look like. And in every single case, the question of historical culpability emerged. The question of, you know, of how we need to look at perhaps a more feminist-centered viewpoint of the economy, of redistribution also emerged. And I think that these iterations are not happening in isolation. They're happening because we are in conversation with each other, and in undefensive, if I may say, conversation with each other.
You've criticised this particular event, which was in the EU Parliament, and probably for the EU Parliament was radical, but obviously that's not a very difficult thing for it to be. I mean, can anything grow out of it? You know, is there a space, you know, is there a space for to meet? Is there a global justice movement? Is it growing anyway? You know,
well, they've been there, Henry. I mean, none of this has happened in a vacuum, right? I mean, I think I mean, there already are many social movements, global. I mean, I don't want to say global because it's difficult to sort of, we're always looking for these umbrella, which is a very corporate approach in and of itself. And I think we should be careful of that. But I mean, I think at local, regional level, there's a myriad of social movements, you know, movement academia and so forth. And I mean, I personally eschew the binary between activism and scholarship, because I sit very squarely on the cusp of, you know, radical hardcore activism and very rigorous academic scholarship. So I actually think that there's the scope for that sort of that nexus to come together. The myriad, I mean, you know, the Wellbeing Alliance, you know, the different offshoots of that. There's the global tapestry of alternatives. There are tons, and I also don't want to be non-egalitarian and name some and not others as well, because that's also problematic. But I mean, at national level, I mean, I know on the African continent, there are myriad, there's a clock going, there are myriad sorts of, you know, movements that are taking place that are very sovereign and you know, very autonomous, that have nothing to do with trying to be organized by INGOs and so on and so forth. But I also think that it's important to, I want to go back and insist, though, that it's really important for Europe to understand that it's in community with others. So if, for example, I mean, we can see the horrible right, you know, the pendulum swinging right, the nightmarish possibility of Trump even running again. I mean, running, him jogging, him strolling again. I mean, any of those scenarios are just nightmarish. And it you know, just begs the question of what kind of a governance pseudo democracy would even allow anybody who is so and, you know, ethically compromised, to say the least, to even be in a situation where he's running for office or even being punted in conversation. But we can see, you know, Le Pen, I mean, I think Macron is even a right-wingish himself. And I think that what Europe needs to understand, in the US, which is why I'm begging friends in the US not to allow Trump to happen again, is that this has global impact. You know, when that nonsense, when the popo hits the fan, we all smell it. You know, it splashes on us as well. It translates into policy, it translates into trade relations, it translates into the way, you know, into conversations on how the conversations on debt, on carbon emissions, you know, who agrees what, who agrees to what, who signs to what. And of course, it is re-inscripted in the way the particular power relations have been conducted over the last 40, 50, 60 years and the contestation between global north and global south re-inscript themselves. And I think the further right a regime is, and the further right the sentiment in the north is, certainly that has a direct impact on certain things. I mean, there was a difference between Obama in office and Trump in office, and not in the ways that you'd expect, you know, in different ways, in more discreet ways as well. So I think that, again, this kind of insularity and, you know, we in Europe were sorting ourselves out and, you know, we are happy with what we're achieving. All of this happens in the context of community. And I think unless we're willing to be more communitarian in our outlook, and appreciate that, you know, this is an ecosystem. I mean, especially as people who are interested in different heterodox ways of global and institutional arrangements, that really has to be very much front and center.
But is post-growth or degrowth as a heading useful? Do you see
I
that?
don't think it should be either. I'm not a proponent of either. I just think those fluff, you know, I think that they both have their own levels of utility. They also have their own levels of fluffiness. And I think that really we need to be thinking about things that go to the heart of the matter. I mean, if we're talking,
it's just
social justice, reparation, restoration, etc. Decolonize the climate. I mean, how's that for a banner to get behind? You know, I think we should say what we mean, where we are conveying the culpability, we're conveying the urgency, and we're conveying that this is not a new struggle. It didn't, as I say, the climate, the globe didn't just get warm. We're conveying that this is linked to a history and her stories of different kinds of extraction and, you know, climate imperialism that we are now seeing the result of, and continuing to see the result of. So I think something and that's also something that's got more, when I say global, I mean international, because the two aren't the same. International resonance. If you're talking to somebody in my neighborhood and you're talking about, oh, climate, you know, boohoo carbon emissions, they'll be like, come on, be serious. I mean, what are you actually trying to say? If you mean, you know, what are you actually trying to convey? So I think it's important that our language should have a level of international and universal intent, and also convey the solidarity that we should also be walking in. I think if we say we are in community or trying to be in community in some way, even though of course we appreciate that contexts and perspectives between the South and the North, the majority and the minority world will of course diverge at certain points, but we hope that they'll converge in the areas that are important.
Brilliant. I think I can see the strands of, you know, that sort of challenging grief growth and the destructiveness on the global South. Maybe there's places to meet there. So hopefully communities can come together around this and look for languages that suit different areas. But this has been a fascinating discussion, and it's great to have that different perspectives, different views. And thank you very much.